Before the great battle at Agincourt, Shakespeare brings together some French nobles who anticipate the battle. And we have a number of statements here that indicate that the French underestimate the English. And we know they underestimate the English because in the battle that comes, the French experience a decisive defeat, an overwhelming defeat. But in the hours before the battle, that's not what we hear from French leaders. We don't get a sense from them that they have a sense of what they're really up against. And so the constable there at the top says, "Alas, poor Harry," that's Henry, "of England, he longs not for the dawning as we do." In other words, we're looking forward to the battle. Henry must not be, because he's facing forces that are so much greater than his. That's the sense, it seems, of what the constable is saying. Orleans says, "What a wretched and peevish fellow is this King of England, to mope with his fat-brained followers, so far out of his knowledge." You know, Henry doesn't know what he's doing with his fat-brained followers. You know, Henry's really got himself into a pickle, you know, having come to France. The constable says again, if the English had any apprehension, that is, if they had any understanding, if they had any knowledge, they would run away. We can skip the next statement from Orleans. We do have this statement from Rambert, which is it's not quite clear to me what Rambert is saying. He says that island of England breeds very valiant creatures. They're mastiffs, that is, that dog, that type of dog, are of unmatchable courage. It's not clear to me if Rambert is implying that, you know, the English may have some tough dogs, but the English themselves are not tough, or if he's offering sort of a counter idea to what's being said, that, you know, actually maybe the English are tougher than what you others are suggesting. But even if that is the case, Rambert's one sentence there is overtaken, overwhelmed by these other comments. Orleans says here, "Foolish curs that run winking into the mouth of a Russian bear and have their heads crushed like rotten apples." So we get the sense from these French nobles that they anticipate an easy victory over the English. They turn out to be wrong. And so we're looking here at the problem of underestimation, of not having a proper estimate of your enemy or of the situation. We see this kind of thing in history. At the beginning of the American Civil War in 1861, there was a general sense among many that the war would be over soon. Often what we hear is, you know, the war will be over by Christmas, right? And there are stories that at the first big battle of the Civil War, that people actually set up picnic blankets on hills so that they could watch the battle as if it were going to be some sort of entertaining event. As President Lincoln says here in his second inaugural address near the end of the Civil War, he says, "Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. No one anticipated that this war would be this long, 4 years. No one anticipated that this war would be this savage, that the war would be this bloody." We see something similar in the First World War. The celebrations that broke out in the late summer of 1914 when war was announced. But no one anticipated that the war would last as long as it did. I don't think very many people anticipated that the war would be as bloody and as tragic as it was. There hadn't been a large-scale war in Western Europe since 100 years before, since the time of Napoleon. But in that 100 years, Western Europe had industrialized, and industrialization had affected military machinery, military arsenals. And so we have artillery that can hurl missiles for many, many, many miles. And of course, this hadn't been seen in Western Europe before, and we have rapid-fire machine guns, and we have poison gas. All sorts of horrors that the world would see for the first time. I don't think in the late summer of 1914 that many people anticipated the horrors of the war to come. They underestimated what this war would bring. In the case of Vietnam, the American struggle in Vietnam, it was understandable that American strategists, that American war planners focused on body count, because reasonably they thought that if in one military engagement after another, if we Americans plus our South Vietnamese allies, plus our South Korean allies, plus our Australian allies, if we kill and wound many more of the enemy than they kill and wound of our own, then we'll win. This is the idea of body count. This is why during Vietnam it's important to take a body count, because it gives us a sense if we're winning the war, and that makes perfect sense. You think, just hypothetically speaking, if in a typical engagement 5 of them are taken out for every one of ours, or the ratio could be higher, 10 of them for every one of ours, if that's the case, then that means we're winning. But there is a kind of there's an underestimation of the enemy, of the enemy's ability to absorb suffering, the enemy's ability to absorb pain, and the enemy's commitment to persevering regardless of costs. Right? This was something that I think was underestimated, the tenacity of the enemy. And after a while, I think it settles in. People realize, oh, this is an enemy that's willing to absorb tremendous suffering, tremendous pain, and is willing to absorb a tremendous disparity in body count. And that realization sets in. But at the outset, perhaps there was an underestimation. An underestimation of a kind of similar tenacity that the United States would see, and that many of its allies would see among the Taliban forces in Afghanistan. In 2001, after the terrorist attacks on the United States in September 2001, soon thereafter the United States and then other countries within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization go into Afghanistan with the purpose of toppling the Taliban government. That's done easily. With the purpose of removing Taliban power in Afghanistan. That's done pretty easily in the short term. But then through time, these Taliban forces and forces allied with the Taliban, they come back and they fight and they persist and they lose a lot. And there's a tremendous disparity in firepower. If you look at these two photographs and you see one side that has weaponry, but nothing like the personal military effects that American and Allied service members will have, the body armor, the night vision goggles, the tremendous variety of weapons, the air power, right? The Taliban, they don't have an air force, right? The Taliban did not have attack helicopters, right? There's a tremendous disparity in power. And yet, we're making this video some almost 20 years after the initial invasion of Afghanistan, and the Taliban once again controls much of that country. At the outset, when that victory seemed to come easily, there was perhaps an underestimation of the tenacity of the enemy in that place. Here we see something similar perhaps in Iraq. In this case, I think there's an underestimation, a misunderstanding of what might happen in Iraq if the government of Iraq is taken down. If the dictator of Iraq, if his power is removed, then what happens? what steps into that hole that's created when we remove the dictator? It seems that there wasn't a whole lot of careful thought about that, or if there was careful thought about it, it seems that that did not lead to a sophisticated and comprehensive plan, because after Saddam Hussein's government and his formal army fall very rapidly, then it's not long before an insurgency grows up in Iraq, and then terrorist forces from outside Iraq come into Iraq to fight American forces, to fight British and other allied forces. We look at these images here and we see that tremendous disparity in power. These insurgent forces in Iraq, they don't have tanks. They don't have fighter jets, right? The American forces do. The British forces do. There's a tremendous disparity in power. But these insurgents are willing to absorb a tremendous amount of suffering, a tremendous amount of pain. When I think about the cases of Vietnam, of Afghanistan, of Iraq, I'm reminded of something that a Vietnam veteran told me. This Vietnam veteran was in the Medical Services Corps. He wrote this memoir, A Different Face of War, where he describes his work in Vietnam as a Medical Service Corps officer. And one of the things he described is he would say, or he says, you know, you would have a place where you have American wounded. And American wounded, they're groaning, they're calling for their moms, they're shouting. It's obvious that they're suffering. And then he said you could go to another place in a medical facility where you had Vietnamese wounded, perhaps South Vietnamese wounded, perhaps enemy Viet Cong, North Vietnamese who were wounded. And he said in those areas there would be silence. And as I talked with him about it, I mean, one of the thoughts that came up is that in these countries, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, where just as in the normal course of life, people live with what by American standards is tremendous hardship. They live with hardship all the time. Normal life for them, from the American point of view, is really hard. And this was the case in Vietnam back in the 1960s, certainly is the case in Afghanistan today, certainly is the case in Iraq today. So you have people who grow up, who live in a society where life is just, from the American perspective, very, very hard. But for them, yeah, it's hard, but it's also normal. This is how life is. And so when war comes, when conflict comes, life gets harder. But they've got a lot of practice of dealing with hardship. Whereas typical, Americans are not going to have that kind of practice. Poor Americans, by the standards of Vietnamese villagers in the 1960s, by the standards of Iraq, by the standards of Afghanistan, poor Americans compared to those are not poor. Lower middle class, even some upper class Americans who, relative to the enemies they face, come from or grow up in luxury, relative luxury, right? Who grow up with relative ease. But they're facing an enemy accustomed to hardship. And yeah, the hardships of war are harder than the hardships of peace, but we still have a lot of practice with hardship. And perhaps when the U.S. gets into these conflicts in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, perhaps this is part of the calculation that isn't considered so much. We see the rapid victories in Iraq 2003, we see the rapid victories in Afghanistan 2001, and we think, well, that was easy. But then the enemy come back, and they come back sometimes in unexpected ways. Or in Vietnam, where almost every battle the Americans win, almost every one the Americans win. The body count disparity is tremendous, and yet this enemy is willing to absorb tremendous suffering, tremendous loss. These things are important to know when, when we're contemplating battle, when we're contemplating war, what is the enemy like? We have this quote from Sun Tzu, who wrote the, sort of the classic, The Art of War. If you know your enemy and yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Knowing yourself, knowing the enemy, important. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. No, it would take some time and some discussion to work out just what Sun Tzu's getting here, but surely the basic idea here is that you want to know yourself, you also want to know the enemy. Something else to bring into this discussion is an old proverb from the book of Proverbs, that pride goes before destruction, a haughty, that is sort of an arrogant spirit before a fall. And down below we have a moment that President George W. Bush himself, acknowledged that he regretted. After that invasion of Iraq in 2003, when Saddam Hussein's government fell so easily, when the Iraqi military fell so quickly, it seemed like mission accomplished, kind of like that first Gulf War back in 1991. Rapid defeat of the Iraqis. Here we go again. We did it again. He doesn't know about the insurgency to come. I don't want to be casually critical of the president. I think it would have been probably impossible for the great majority of leaders not to exult in what seems like another pretty easy victory. But there was something, it's a strong word, but there was perhaps something arrogant. There was perhaps something haughty. There was something perhaps prideful, in the negative sense of that word, in President Bush's presumptuousness. That looking back, I'm sure President Bush would say the better approach would have been to quietly relish what seems like an easy victory, but to be serious about what might come. What are the next steps? What do we need to do? Let's not pull out the cheerleaders yet. Let's be cautious. Let's employ some humility. I think President Bush would agree with that. Now, as a counterexample, where there's not underestimation, a counterexample would be preparation for the invasion of France in 1944. This is what's going to have to happen. If France is going to be liberated, Belgium, the Netherlands, if these countries are going to be liberated, then northern France is going to have to be invaded. And this D-Day invasion, this invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, there's no underestimation here. Military planners know that they are facing a very serious adversary. The German military is an absolutely dead serious machine. They know that they're facing serious defenses. They know that they can fail. There's a lot of planning that goes into this, years of planning that goes into this invasion. And even on the day itself, as the D-Day invasion is unfolding in France, President Franklin Roosevelt addresses the nation on the radio, and he addresses the nation in the form of a prayer. And one of the things he says to God in this prayer, but actually he's speaking to the American people. I think this is a very clever way of conveying information, conveying thoughts to the American people, but indirectly, because he's speaking to God in prayer. But Franklin Roosevelt, praying, says, "They will need thy blessings." Why will these American, Canadian, British, and other Allied forces invading Normandy, why will they need God's blessing? Because their road will be long and hard. There's no underestimation here. The enemy is strong. There's no underestimation. Look at this next sentence. It's pretty compelling. He may hurl back our forces. In other words, we may fail. There's no underestimation here. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. In other words, we're not going to give up. Even if the enemy does hurl us back, we're going to come back again and again and again. So this is not defeatism, right? There's strength here. We're going to come back. But on this occasion, we may fail. There's an amount of realism here. We understand the enemy. We know what the enemy's capable of. We're not going to underestimate the enemy. We're going to plan very, very carefully, right? And it's the largest invasion from the sea ever in the history of the world, and it is an overwhelming success, although with significant loss of life. So the theme is underestimation, and I suppose the life lesson here is that it's always important to move through our days and to face the challenges we face with a degree of humility. Try to know as much as we can. Try to think as clearly as we can. Try to have as much information as we can. And always bear in mind the recognition, or always bear in mind the thought that there's something we probably don't know, that there are some things that we can't control and can't foresee. It's always good to carry on in life with a degree of humility.